Well, thank you for participating in today's webinar, Creating Dementia-Friendly Faith Communities. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Susan McFadden.
Thank you, Emily. I'm very pleased to be able to present this webinar today. This is an issue that I have been thinking about and working on for a long time, starting years before the term dementia-friendly became rather well known. So it's an issue that people have been working on, and what I've tried to do is to pull together a number of ideas that I hope will be helpful to you. So here's the outline of the webinar. I want to begin by really getting into the question of why faith communities should be dementia-friendly. Then I want to take up the issue of the fact that dementia is a progressive condition. And in our culture, most of the time, that progressive condition is seen as a slide into darkness. And I want to change that story, because I want us to be able to acknowledge that while there are many losses associated with the progression of dementia, that strengths remain. And I think that faith communities are in a very good position to remind our culture of those strengths. The next thing I want to do is to take 10 principles that are defined by the Alzheimer's Society of the United Kingdom for dementia-friendly communities and apply these principles to faith communities to show you how you can take general ideas about dementia-friendly communities and focus them on faith communities in particular. The last two topics will be the barriers that people may face in trying to make their faith communities more dementia-friendly, and also the many opportunities there are. So let's get started. Why be dementia-friendly? Well, here's an obvious reason. Because older adults are often very well connected to faith communities. In fact, some people say, oh, the graying of the church is a bad thing, and it indicates a dying church. Well, I think that there's another way to see that, because I think the older adults who show up at worship services and other programs of faith communities are demonstrating to us tremendous courage and resilience. I've seen people on Sunday mornings coming in with oxygen tanks and walkers and wheelchairs, and they may be there on days that are snowy or rainy, and I have tremendous admiration for what it takes to get them there. And I think we need to honor that and honor the fact that these older people still have much to contribute to faith communities. In other words, we need to change the story of many faith communities, which focuses on younger persons, children, young adults, young families, etc. I'll return to that issue later. So that's the first reason why we should be dementia-friendly. Another reason is because faith communities already have set in place many volunteer ministries, so that they have people who already are trained to reach out to those who have various needs. Sometimes they're called deacons. In some faith communities, they're called Stephen ministers. In others, they may have other titles. But overall, these are individuals who really want to care for persons who have various needs within the faith community. So these volunteer ministries are already established, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about how we might conform them more to the ideals of a dementia-friendly community. Here's another reason why I think faith communities should be dementia-friendly, and that is because of the core values of the world's religions. The core values that state that all persons, regardless of their vulnerabilities and frailties, are to be valued. And the core values that say that all of us have vulnerabilities. Also, if you think about what we generally call the golden rule, we can find expressions of this in all the major world religions. For example, in Christianity, most people are familiar with a saying from Matthew 7, verse 12, that is, do for others what you want them to do for you. This is the meaning of the law of Moses and of the teaching of the prophets. Turning to Judaism, another Abrahamic faith, we find in the Talmud this statement: what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. This is the entire law. All the rest is commentary. And finally, in Islam, another Abrahamic faith, we find this: no one of you is a believer until he desires for his brother that which he desires for himself. We can find similar statements in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, etc. Overall, this is saying that we want to do for people who have dementia what we would want others to do for us if we had dementia. And that's a pretty much a core value in the world's religions. So it's another reason why we should think about being dementia friendly. I want to move to another point now, and that is that dementia and Alzheimer's disease in particular has been called the theological disease. This is from a book by David Keck called Forgetting Whose We Are. And it's not on the bibliography, but you can find it on Amazon. I checked a couple of days ago. And by the way, if you don't have a copy of the bibliography, feel free to contact me or Emily, because Emily has a copy of that as well. It contains various books that I think might be helpful in the libraries of faith communities. So let's look at a couple points related to this idea that dementia is a theological disease. The first one is that very often we hear this statement in the Abrahamic traditions that religious faith is remembering God and being mindful of God in all that I say and do. My husband, who was raised in the Catholic Church, says he remembers that very well from catechism class. But the question comes, can you hold faith if you no longer can remember God and the creedal commitments that you made as a young person when you entered into this faith? Are you still really a member of this household of faith? Another point here is that dementia evokes spiritual questions about meaning. And I'll deal with that later on in the webinar. But that's another reason why we think of dementia as a theological disease, because it takes us to the very inner most questions that we have about the meaning of our lives. And finally, it's a theological disease because it raises these questions about what it means to be a self or a creature formed in the divine image. Some of you may be familiar with the Quaker statement from George Fox that says, there is that of God in everyone. Well, yes, and that includes people with very advanced dementia, the Quakers would tell us, and I think other faith communities would agree. So how can congregations prepare to be more dementia friendly? Well, I think there's a number of ways they can do this. The first one is that they need to look at their own attitudes and assumptions about the process of aging, about older adults in general, and about dementia in particular. I have found through the years that there is a lot of ageism in faith communities. Older adults tell me that they recognize this and they don't like it. They see that their congregations are putting a lot of resources into children's programming and youth program, which they applaud. They want that to happen, but they feel hurt that fewer resources might be directed towards older adults. I've also found ageism among clergy. And that just breaks my heart. I've heard clergy make jokes about older people, and clergy who seem to resist their own aging. And that is a form of ageism. So that needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be critically addressed. Another thing that congregations need to do is to reflect theologically on aging and dementia, not to see programs about aging as just, you know, a simple, how can you have more fun when you're an older person, but to really dig deeply into what I referred to earlier as these core values. And to think about some of the major questions that religions raise for us. You know, what is the good life? All religions ask that question of what is the good life? Well, what does that mean for someone who has dementia? What is the good life for someone who has dementia, whether at the beginning of the journey or at the end? All religions ask, what is fulfillment? And how can the religion direct you toward fulfillment? And that's a question, too, that we need to engage with related to people who have dementia. The final and very important point I want to make here is that anytime a congregation is talking about being more dementia-friendly, it needs to have older adults and people living with dementia in on that discussion. This is a core value of the dementia-friendly community movement, that we need to be dementia inclusive. So let me turn now to my next theme, which has to do with time and the fact that we're talking about a progressive condition. This image here of broken glass is an image that I often use because dementia can be a psychologically shattering experience. Just getting that diagnosis can be a shattering experience. And yet I believe that faith communities can tell a new story about how we accompany one another through sorrow and suffering. That faith communities can help us hold two seemingly opposed ideas in tension. The one that, yes, this is a shattering experience, and on the other hand, I can still hold on to hope. So how do you keep those two ideas in creative tension with each other? The shattering and the hope. And I believe that faith communities are resources within our wider society that can help us work on those kinds of issues. So let's turn to this question of the shattering of the diagnosis. What does it feel like when the doctor says, quote, you have dementia, most probably of the Alzheimer's disease type? A rather typical statement that people will often hear. Well, their responses can take these forms. My life is over. Now what? How am I going to tell my spouse, partners, children, grandchildren, friends, boss? How am I going to tell people about this diagnosis? After all, if I had been diagnosed with cancer or diagnosed with heart disease, I'd tell my friends and they'd know what I was talking about. But what about Alzheimer's disease or some other form of dementia that people may not have even heard of? And then these questions: what did I do to deserve this? I often hear people say that. And finally, this one: why did God let this happen to me? Now, that's a rather typical question that is sometimes brought to clergy or other friends within the faith community, and it's one that needs to be taken seriously. Here are two more questions that people will often ask when they get the diagnosis. Will anyone still love me? And can my life still have meaning? And I hope that faith communities can answer yes to both of those questions. But how do you get to yes? How do you get to the trust that is required for you to be able to answer yes to affirm that people will still love you and that life can still have meaning. Well, one way, I think, is that if you have someone who is what I call a spiritual companion. We need spiritual companionships for the diagnosed person as well as for care partners through this whole journey of dementia. And I now want to turn to some thinking about what this spiritual companionship might look like. And the first thing we need to do is to talk about what spirituality is. Now, we've only got a few more minutes in this webinar, and we could spend a few more days talking about this question of what is spirituality. But I'd like to point us toward a model of spirituality that I've found to be particularly helpful. It comes from the work of a woman named Elizabeth McKinley. You can Google her or look her up on Amazon. She's written a number of books about spirituality and aging and dementia. She's Australian. She has a PhD in gerontological nursing, and she's also an Episcopalian priest. If you look in the middle of this diagram, you can see that she talks about spirituality as a sense of ultimate meaning, and it can be mediated or it can be brought into our lives through a number of different sources. One, looking at the top, would be through relationships we have with other people. We sometimes can feel like we have a very deeply meaningful relationship with other people and with God. This is a question that sometimes people raise. Can you still be spiritual if you don't believe in God? And there's a lot of argument about that out there, but I think you can. So the point here is to focus on this sense of meaning that comes from our relationships. We can also have this sense of meaning through connections with the creation, the created world, and the environment, nature, the work that we do, the works of human imagination. And that takes us to another way that meaning comes into our lives, and that's through the arts. All kinds of forms of the arts can convey to us spiritual experiences. And finally, obviously, through religion and the various activities that people engage in their religious communities. So I think that this is a nice kind of holistic model for spirituality. And now let's apply it to this idea of spiritual companionship. Spiritual companionship is first and foremost a relationship with the person having dementia, and also, in many cases, the care partner for that individual. A spiritual companionship can be prompted by religious faith, that is, it can be motivated by the religious faith, and it also obviously can occur within religious settings like congregations. But it can be nurtured by shared enjoyment of the arts, and also by shared enjoyment of the natural world. And note that I'm talking about that sense of relationship by shared enjoyment. That is, that a spiritual companion can sit with a person, perhaps in a long-term care setting, and look outside at a beautiful day, or sit outside and feel the wind and the sunshine, and that can be a spiritual experience. So what do spiritual companions do? Well, they accompany people through the whole journey. They don't just pay attention to people when they get the diagnosis, but they're in that relationship for the long haul, and they need to be able to assure people that they will accompany them. They also adapt to the changing needs of people with dementia. This is a progressive condition, and so the spiritual companion needs to know that the interactions that were had at the beginning of the journey may be different from those at the end. They need to change their own behaviors by accommodating and learning new communication techniques as the dementia progresses. The individual may no longer be able to speak, And yet there are lots of ways that we can have meaningful communication with a person who has dementia when they have lost verbal abilities. So they make changes in themselves by learning these new communication techniques. And finally, they reach out to the wider society and they advocate by telling this new story about dementia and enduring personhood, so that when they hear people who only have the dark vision about dementia, they will say, yes, but the other day I had the most wonderful experience with my friend who has advanced dementia, and we were sitting in a room and we were painting and listening to music, and it was just a marvelous way for us to connect, and it felt spiritual. That's an example of telling a new story about dementia and personhood. Now, what does it take to be a spiritual companion for people living with dementia? Well, a willingness to learn about dementia, that's pretty obvious. Patience. Not everything is going to go as you had planned, and so you need to be open to things and change your route and just be patient with the person who may ask you the same question over and over again. You need to be humble about your own vulnerabilities and your own abilities to connect with someone having dementia, so it takes humility. It takes spiritual support from others. I've been with groups who get together on a monthly or a quarterly meeting, groups of spiritual companions, and they talk with each other about the challenges that they've faced and also the great joy that they've experienced. But they get support in those groups, and I think that's really important. And finally, I put up here prayer, because you find some form of prayer in nearly all the world's faith communities. And I always go back to a quote from one of, well, he was America's first psychologist, William James, one of my favorite psychologists. He wrote a wonderful book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And this famous Bostonian psychologist said this about prayer. He said that it is the very soul and essence of religion. And so I think it's important to raise that up. So who's going to be accompanied? Well, obviously the person who has received the diagnosis, but it's very important to remember the care partner and other family members, some of whom may be children and teenagers or college students, and we need to remember them as well. And also friendship networks, because friends play such an important role in the lives of persons having dementia, and yet we know that all too often those friendship networks get frayed over the course of dementia. Friends fall away, and it seems to me that spiritual companions might help to prevent that. So let's turn now to applying these 10 key areas for action that came from the Alzheimer's Society to becoming a dementia-friendly faith community. I want to start with a really important point, which I've already addressed earlier, but I want to return to it. And that is that when we are setting out to become a dementia-friendly faith communities, people with dementia and their care partners need to be included. There's a wonderful slogan that comes out of the disability rights movement that is, "Nothing about us without us." That is, don't make plans, don't design programs and services for people having dementia without asking them whether this is something that might appeal to them. Dementia is a disability, and I think that that's part of the new story that we're telling. And it can be accommodated with patience and kindness. So we usually think about accommodating disabilities with hearing loops or elevators or ramps for wheelchairs, but we accommodate dementia with patience and kindness. So that's number one on this list of key areas for action from the United Kingdom that we apply to faith communities. But let's look at the second one, and that is that we need to challenge the stigma and build understanding about dementia. We need to tell that new story. And how do we do this? We can do it through the worship service by showing that we are being inclusive in the worship service. After all, you know, some people may stop bringing their loved one who has dementia to church because he or she may speak out during the service or you know, act in some way that the care partner thinks is wrong, and yet we allow little kids to eat Cheerios in a worship service. So I think we need to learn to be more tolerant of people having dementia. And I connect that to preaching. When was the last time you heard a clergy person get up in front of a faith community and preach about those theological challenges that dementia raises? Because after all, dementia probably touches the lives of nearly everybody sitting in the pews. And I think it's important that occasionally we hear that articulated through preaching. Faith communities engage in education, and so they can educate about the stigma of dementia and build understanding for all ages, starting with children and teenagers, young adults, etc. And finally, that advocacy effort to reach out to the community to tell this new story about dementia and about the maintenance of personhood throughout the journey of dementia. Number 3 on the list is to provide accessibility. So I've already mentioned hearing loops, because a lot of people who have dementia also have problems with hearing. They may have mobility problems, so if the faith community has the resources, it should definitely have elevators. If they have a fellowship hall, as they're generally called, on the lower level, well, people need to be able to get to them. And finally, how can you improve your church bulletin or whatever you pass out to people during the worship service so that it can be better read by people with visual impairments, and so it'd be more understandable by people who have dementia. So here are 3 more points that also come from the UK that we can apply to faith communities. We need to acknowledge the potential of people having dementia, the fact that they can still participate in many of the activities of the faith community. I have seen, for example, in faith communities where an individual with dementia can still read aloud, so may be able to stand in front of the congregation and read scripture, if someone stands next to that person and points to the line that he or she is reading and moves their finger down the page, so they can still participate. And there are lots of other examples how people can continue to participate. We need to encourage and support early diagnosis. This is something you find in nearly all lists of things that dementia-friendly communities need to do, is to help people get an early diagnosis so that they can plan for what this journey is going to look like, so that they can make needed changes in their lives, perhaps in diet and exercise and social connections, so that the congregation can do this as well. And remember, I talked about the shattering of the diagnosis. The faith community can follow up with people and offer support and assure people that they will be accompanied. It can offer practical support on how to engage in the life of the faith community. Some faith communities are starting to offer special worship services for people having dementia, and that is something to consider as to whether that might be valued by people. Of course, it would be important to ask them whether they would value that. Point 7. This one is something that is really near and dear to my heart, and that is that dementia-friendly communities talk about living well with dementia and living well in the community. And I strongly believe that we need to say that that includes not just people living in private homes and apartments, wherever, so-called independent lives, but that needs to also include people living in memory care residences. Too often, these memory care residences are like castles in our communities. They may not look like castles, and they may not have visible moats around them. And yet I think there are sometimes invisible moats. That is, that we drive past these places all the time, but who crosses over that invisible moat into the long-term care community? The people who work there and the families of the residents. How often does the community cross into the long-term care community? How well do we make those residents of the long-term care community feel like they are still valued members of the wider community? I think that faith communities can offer a lot of guidance about that. Here's 2 more points. Offer reliable transportation. You know that we are challenged by the fact that people very often get to the point where they no longer can drive. And it may be, I know of one couple right now in my own faith community where the husband has been diagnosed with 2 forms of dementia, and his wife has various visual problems and soon will have to give up driving. He's been told he can no longer drive, and I don't know that she can drive for much longer. But they have been long-time faithful members of a congregation. So how are they going to continue to participate? Because we don't have reliable bus transportation on Sunday mornings. And so this whole transportation question is one that needs to be examined if the faith community truly wants to be dementia-friendly. We want to make sure our environments are easy to navigate. How many times have you been to, say, a funeral at a church building or a synagogue, and you're wandering around after the funeral trying to find the restrooms? So, you know, we need to make sure that the environment is easy to navigate, to get around. And this is not just going to help people who have dementia, it's going to help all of us when we do this. You know, that's kind of a central idea in this notion of making dementia-friendly communities. When we make our communities dementia-friendly, we help everyone. Wouldn't you want to live in a community where people are patient and kind to others? Well, yes. So when our environments are easy to navigate, they are helpful to all persons. And then the last point that the Alzheimer's Society in the UK emphasizes for dementia-friendly communities is this idea of outreach or advocacy, I've called it, and that is to spread dementia awareness to other organizations in the community, to work with other organizations. Sometimes in communities we have Purple Angel programs where businesses and other kinds of organizations like the YMCA or the public library are trained in how to communicate with people with dementia, how to interact in a helpful way. This kind of training is important, and faith communities could encourage this to take place within their own environments and reaching out beyond them. So think about that. Now, what are the barriers that some faith communities might experience in trying to become dementia-friendly? Well, I've been working on these issues since the 1970s, and I can tell you that seminaries where clergy are trained do not offer much education about aging and even less about dementia. This has been an issue that has been challenging us for all these decades. Many seminaries will train clergy to be in working with families. They have an emphasis on children and youth, but rarely do we find courses that will teach clergy about, say, the physiological changes that come with aging, or that teach clergy specifically about interacting with individuals who have dementia and their care partners. So this is something that is really a significant barrier and needs to be addressed. Remember, I talked about those ageist attitudes that are sometimes held within congregations, and that is definitely a barrier. People will say, oh no, we need to focus on getting more youth into this faith community. Well, yes, that's important, but let's not forget about the older adults who are already there. Then there's this problem of the denial of suffering. You may question this because I talked before about people who have that shattering experience, and it is a form of suffering. And yet, here's a quote I'd like to read to you. This comes from a woman whose husband has dementia, and she feels like their difficult situation is not taken seriously by people in her faith community or even by the pastors. She said this. She said, I withdrew from my lively church because I was just unable to face people who keep telling me what a wonderful person my husband is. Well, that's all fine to affirm what a wonderful person her husband is, but she felt like they were ignoring the challenges of everyday life caring for her husband. And that's a major issue. Here's another issue that comes up often, and that is gossip. We know that there can be plenty of gossip within faith communities, and it can be incredibly hurtful. So here's another quote. This is a woman who had dementia, and she was being interviewed by some researchers, and this is what she said. I really don't like my private information being bandied about and occasionally being the object of church gossip. That's pretty much what these prayer requests are. People think, quote, oh, the poor courageous man who's bearing so much from her for so many years. So she feels like people are gossiping about her and her husband, and that's hurtful to her. But besides these barriers for faith communities, we also have opportunities. We have opportunities for spiritual companionship, as I was saying before. When we open up accessibility for people who have dementia, it makes the whole place more accessible for everyone. And finally, by really digging deep into these challenging issues raised by dementia, these issues of what it means to hold on to meaning in life and hope, and the idea that even in the most advanced stages of dementia, the individual still can contribute to others, can still show joy and laughter and love. That is a source of spiritual growth for the whole faith community. Finally, we tell this new story. We tell this story of I and thou. Some of you may know that phrase from the work of the Jewish philosopher and theologian Martin Buber, who talked about how we need always to treat other people as a thou. We don't want to use people as an it, but we always want to honor them as a thou. And that's the story that we need to tell about people who have dementia. We can tell a new story about the possibilities of joyous life in community, and that would include individuals who have dementia, and think about not only the person who has the diagnosis, but the care partners as well. And finally, we can tell a new story that it is possible to live with meaning, but it's going to take those kinds of relationships that I described earlier to be able to convey that sense that meaning is possible even in dementia. So that's the end of my webinar. I want to thank Emily for setting this up. I thank all of you for listening. Remind you that I would be glad to be in contact with any of you. And I wish you well as you think about how a faith community can become dementia-friendly.
Great. Thank you, Susan, for such a fabulous presentation.